Hey Kings, what's poppin'? It's me, Cheems of Regret. Recently, I gave the Final Fantasy VII Remake a swing to finally see what all the hype was about. The short of it is that it's not my sort of game. It was very pretty, but the gameplay loop just wasn't for me. It honestly felt very boring, but that's beside the point of the video. Back on track. As a rule of thumb, I give up on a game if it doesn't click with me by 2 hours. When I mentioned about how the game just bored me before even hitting the 2-hour mark, I was bombarded with several replies saying that, "Oh, it gets better after X amount of hours." And you know what? That's not a good counter argument. Like, at all. I'll get into it in a bit, but before I do, if you like the content I'm putting out, remember to like, subscribe, share, as well as follow me on my socials. The support helps me keep this channel running. So, back to the topic at hand. Seeing those replies telling me to slog it out until I got to the mid-game got me thinking, how long should it take for a game to hook a player? My preference is 2 hours, as I previously stated, but this is mostly because of Steam's refund eligibility being capped at 2 hours of play. This is simply too narrow of a perspective, hence why I made my previous polls asking you kings about how you all treated the issue. Now, a bit of a disclaimer, I must admit that since my channel is a gaming-centered channel, one that grew from the niche subject of laughing at console fanboys at that, I will obviously attract a more invested audience, let's just say. The results I've gotten are absolutely not to be taken as gospel, but they do get me a good feel for gamers and gaming patterns. So with that all established, I can confidently say that telling someone that the game gets good after X amount of hours, be it 10, maybe 20, 50, or God forbid 100 hours, is frankly stupid. Like seriously, it's stupid. Now, I'm not saying that a game experience couldn't get better after that many hours. Some games may take time to spool up, to build up the experience. It'll always take time for players to get fully accustomed to the different mechanics and the flow of a game. So it's expected that there will be a period in which they'll slowly learn about the game and eventually become proficient at it. Obviously, once a player is proficient at the game, it could be said that the gameplay experience would be significantly more enjoyable than when the player knew jack all about what he was doing. In this sense, the game does get better after X amount of hours. Personal examples I can cite are games like Stellaris, Civilization, or XCOM 2. These are the kind of games which require the player to learn a crap load of gameplay mechanics and systems to fully enjoy. Another possibility then is that perhaps the game's narrative takes time to build up and requires a lot of time investment to fully pay off. Perhaps the story beats that seem pointless in the first few hours of the game would turn out to be extremely important. Maybe the different narrative threads introduced separately would click together to form an amazing moment that would make all the hassle worth it. In this possibility, yes, the game does indeed get better after that many hours played. Games that are like this that I can personally recall are Ace Combat 7 and the Bureau XCOM Declassified. The narratives of these games seem unfocused or even a bit lackluster at first, but expects the players to stick around to get a satisfying conclusion. The last possibility I can think of is that the way the game's features or the resources the players have access to are slowly built up over time, to the point where the mid to late game experience is significantly more enjoyable compared to the early game experience because of these features. In a game like this, the game does indeed get better after time is spent unlocking those features or resources. I'm not talking about new abilities or whatnot that shake up the game, I'm talking about whole ass features that fundamentally change how a game works. Now, I perfectly acknowledge that games like these exist. Game design can get pretty complicated these days, and it's perfectly understandable that some games just take more time to get into than others. The problem here is that saying it gets better after 10, 20, maybe 50 hours in is a shitty reason to keep playing. It doesn't address the fact that the player isn't having fun at the very moment. The game is simply not engaging them, so what reason do they have to keep playing? If the vague promise that the unengaging game that they're playing right now could potentially turn into a great game is all you can give them, then frankly there's something wrong with the game. See, in life there are two things that are most definitely finite. That is, time and money. You will never have enough time and money to experience all the things you've always wanted to do. There is a cost and a trade-off to chasing every opportunity that must be considered. Going to a fancy dinner place might mean you're not spending money on your hobbies. Working hard to afford those expensive hobbies might mean you'll have less free time on your hands. This is a constant in life. Every action has a corresponding reaction. Optimally speaking, people make decisions with this in mind. With that being established, I'm sure you're starting to understand why it gets better after 50 hours is a bad reason to continue playing a game. People's times aren't infinite, especially when you consider that the primary demographic of gamers aren't kids living with their parents anymore, but adults who have jobs and responsibilities. Going by the United States alone, almost 40% of players say they're between the 18 to 34-year-old age gap. Looking at my own channel analytics, I can totally believe those figures. These people have responsibilities to attend to. That cuts away from free time. Even if we assume that the average player spent an extremely generous 20-hour-a-week gaming, that boils down to about 3 hours a day. Are you really going to spend 3 hours a day for several weeks straight playing an unengaging game constantly just to have it get better? No, of course you're not. You're going to ditch it and pick up something else that engages better. And ultimately, that's the rub. Even if the mid to late game experience is exceptionally good, if the early game experience is unengaging, boring, or even bad, it'll likely make players drop the game before they even get to the good stuff. Especially if it takes a lot of hours to get to that point. Obviously, this now begs the question, how do you solve these problems? If your game does get better after a boatload of hours in, how do you keep players around until that point? Now, I'm no game designer, but I feel like I've played enough games that I can offer a few choice suggestions. First off, if your game requires the player to learn a metric shit ton of game mechanics to maximize their enjoyment of the game, then realistically you have two options. One is to get your players up to speed as expediently as possible, and option two is to motivate the players enough to want to get better at the game, thus making them stick around. Personally, the main reason I stuck through the hellish first hours of Stellaris is because I was hell-bent in recreating the Imperium of Man. I wager it took me at least 20 hours to properly grasp the basics of the game, but in those 20 hours I was enraptured by the game's lore, discovery of the unknown, and the political drama that surrounded me. It also helped that the game provides a lot of tools to help me learn the mechanics on the fly. Even though I wasn't enjoying the game at its full potential, the game was still engaging me and kept me interested from both gameplay and narrative perspectives. Second off, if your narrative starts slow or a bit lackluster, then you absolutely need to keep the players engaged by gameplay. So long as the game is enjoyable to play, the player can somewhat turn a blind eye to a mediocre story. The problem comes when the gameplay becomes stale and the story hasn't picked up the pace. Most modern Ubisoft games tend to suffer from this. I've been told that the story of Watch Dogs 1 gets pretty good later down the line, but I can't even stomach the first few missions, let alone many more hours of it. I dropped that game very quickly. Thirdly, some games ask you to slog through dozens, if not hundreds of hours to get to the state in which the game is fantastic. These games are bloated and should be cut down to size. Seriously, if the game is a much better experience at the late game to the point that it's almost entirely unrecognizable from the early game, then why not just trim all the bad stuff and double down on the good stuff? Seriously, why even design your game like this? That's just dumb. You want your players to have a good first impression, a good first experience, and to have it progressively get better. Having them start with a bad experience and progressively get to the good stuff is just a waste of time. What confuses me about this particular issue is that some players treat the slog to late game good stuff as a rite of passage, like, what? That's just fucking stupid. If you're advocating for hours upon hours of unengaging gameplay to precede potentially good gameplay, maybe 50, maybe 100 hours in, then man, don't be surprised when the game dies out quick because new players ditch the game fast. Finally, now begs the question, how soon should a game hook the player? Well, going by the numbers on my poll, around 2 hours, but I'm not just basing this on my community poll. I've looked through the global achievement stats on some Steam games and the numbers back it up. Warframe gives you an achievement for playing more than 2 hours. Only 40% of all players have this achievement, 25 have the 10-hour playtime achievement, and just about 12 have the 100-hour achievement. Over 50% of Fallout New Vegas players haven't finished the second quest in the main quest line. Only 36% of all Splitgate players have finished 25 matches. Almost 30% of Mass Effect Legendary Edition players quit before they finished the Citadel intro, and almost 40% never bothered getting to Liara. All of the above mentioned achievements should be easy to get. Hell, you should be able to get them in around 2 to 5 hours. If you can't even keep your players invested within 2 hours, then it doesn't matter how amazing the game can get later down the line. They're not going to bother. There are shitloads of other games for them to play, and they've just decided that yours isn't one of them. So if you're a game dev and you happen to be watching this video, here's a word of advice for you. Please respect the player's time when designing your games. The player will love you all the more for it. Anyways, that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed watching this video, then remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share to help support the channel. This has been Cheems of Regret, wishing you all good luck and Godspeed. Signing out.